Hello and good afternoon from the French Development Agency headquarters here in Paris. Welcome to this live event. Before we begin, a few words on logistics. This event is in English, but AI-powered live translation into French is available through the Interprefy app. You may access it by clicking on the Apps button on the bottom right side of your screen and selecting French. You can then choose between an audio track by clicking on the headphone icon and subtitles by clicking on the eye icon. Pour notre public francophone, un service d'interprétariat par intelligence artificielle vers le français est disponible via l'application Interprefy. Vous pouvez y accéder en cliquant sur le bouton Application en bas à droite de votre écran et en sélectionnant Interprefy. Vous pouvez ensuite choisir entre une traduction audio en cliquant sur l'icône du casque et des sous-titres en cliquant sur l'icône en forme d'œil et sélectionner French-Français. And now a few introductory remarks from Thomas Melunio, the Chief Economist of the French Development Agency.
Yeah, bonjour à toutes et à tous. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone, depending on when you are. Welcome at EFD. As Etienne just mentioned it, we are today gathered to discuss and present a new book in the African Development Forum series. So today we're going to discuss Migrants, Markets and Mayors, Migrants, Marchés et Maires, which is roughly the 30th book published in this Africa Development Forum series, a joint publication between the World Bank Group and EFD over the last 15 years now. Amongst the various books, the themes we are going to discuss today were already to some extent, but perhaps more superficially, but dealt with in previous books. So I would encourage you to refer to this collection series of books, check the previous references, and again, let me now move on to today's topic. Of course, we are discussing in English today. Etienne just mentioned it. We have a translation into French, whether written or oral, which you can select from the app on the lower part of your screen. Just to let you know, we also had previous books like L'Afrique en commun, Africa in Commons, where you can have you can access long summaries in Swahili, also in Arabic, in the framework of our new translation policy. So we hope you will enjoy not only this interface, but also the fact that we are paying more attention and effort to bring this content to an audience that is just as wide as possible. So today we're going to have the editors, directors of this book, so namely Luc Christensen and Nancy Lozano Gracia, to discuss in particular urbanization in Africa. Some of the topics just as an appetizer of today's conference. We're going to discuss cities in Africa, also migration from rural, but also from secondary cities to bigger cities within secondary cities, a topic that's of huge interest for EFD. While we had probably in the past a tendency to discuss mostly the growth in the megalopolis in Africa, today we'd like to bring more focus towards secondary cities. More generally speaking, we've seen the growth in urban population in Africa at a level of 5 or even above per year, so 5.4%. It's a sort of main figure we'd like to get out of this book, which truly shows the dynamics of urbanization in Africa. We're going to enter a little bit more into the details of that growth, the share, but let me not say everything here, but the share that comes from the internal growth of cities, but also from migration. We're going also to discuss the policies to address this phenomenon and the role that potential actors like the World Bank or EFD might play. So without further ado, let me welcome the main authors and editors of that book, which probably you can join me on stage now. And thanks again to the World Bank colleagues for this joint work and the edition and this event today.
Thank you, Thomas Melunio. Before we begin our conversation, I would also like to thank the team here in Paris that made this event possible. Sabrina Hadjat-Shaoul, Carla Saez, Niuin, Adeline Olanier. Thank you also to Marc Deboni for his technical assistance. And I would also like to thank colleagues in the Public Relations Office of the World Bank in Washington, D.C., Patricia Karayama and Joel McFadden, and in the Office of the Chief Economist for the Africa region, Beatrice Berman. We're very happy to launch yet another title, Africa Development Forum series, a long-standing collaboration between the French Development Agency and the World Bank Group. I encourage you to explore the more than 30 reports that have been published in the series since 2015. They are available in open access on the websites of both institutions. Here's some examples of titles. We're joined now by the two co-authors of the Migrants, Markets, and Mayors report, here with us in the EFD studio and remotely. Our conversation with the authors will be followed by a response and by a short roundtable discussion, and there will be, of course, time for questions from you in the audience. You can write in your questions in English or in French at any time using the chat function of the platform. Let me now introduce our authors. Dr. Luc Christensen, here with me, holds a PhD in agricultural economics from Cornell. He's a lead agricultural economist in the Eastern and Southern Africa unit of the Agricultural and Food Global Practice of the World Bank and head of the Agricultural Policy Action Lab based in Paris. Remotely joining is Dr. Nancy Lozano Gracia. She holds a PhD in applied economics from the University of Illinois. She's the lead economist for sustainable development in Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as the co-lead for the Global Solutions Group on Spatial and Territorial Development. Thank you to both of you for joining us today. Thank you, Luc. Thank you, Nancy. The report, which I should note was founded under the Cities Alliance Cities and Migration Program, is quite successful in debunking a number of preconceptions regarding the different forms of internal migration and their impacts on African cities. In particular, the volume analyzes the urban challenges brought forth by migration to Africa's secondary cities. We'll talk about that. And at the same time, it offers insight on the policy options that can help these cities leverage migration to rise above the employment challenge. That's the subtitle of the book. Luc, can you give us a sense of the main findings of the report to start our conversation today?
Thanks a lot, Etienne, and thanks to AFD to hosting us and give us the opportunity to talk about the findings. So maybe take a step back. So I've already mentioned the world is urbanizing rapidly. Much of that urbanization, the move of people to urban centers, is in Asia, is in Africa. So especially Africa, we see still quite a bit of urbanization happening. And whatever evidence there is in West Africa, for example, early 2000s, there has been some studies which looked especially in West Africa, where they found that migration into cities was actually not leading to these dire outcomes of the migrants joining the ranks of the unemployed, etc. The facts were not like that. But that's 2000, and that's West Africa only. There's also some evidence from China, where basically they found through quite rigorous analysis that if migrants come to the cities, that actually they're better off, and all the others are better off because indeed this sort of agglomeration economies, the cities getting bigger, getting greater demands for goods and services, etc. So that was another study in China, this case, where you sort of get a positive effect. So the world has been urbanizing, but typically at higher levels of development. Along with that comes that Africa is urbanizing while its agricultural productivity isn't going up. So it's sort of a push. People are pushed out. It's through distress migration, if you want. And Africa is urbanizing with a population growth which is much faster. So there are some macro factors which are different. A second key thing, what we have talked about a bit already, is the way people have looked in these studies at urbanization is really moving from rural areas to cities. So that has been the dominant view in looking and investigating the effect of migration on urban. So that's one. While yet 97% of the urban centers are actually secondary towns or urban centers of less than 300,000 people. So we want to bring and look more at the secondary cities. The second point, is that it has been about rural to urban migration, but there's also actually quite a bit of movements between cities and towns. So what about that urban migration? Because for the mayor, it doesn't matter where they come from. In principle, if they come from another city or if they come from the rural areas, that's more people in the city. Flip side is also that people move out, of course. But sort of from the mayor's point, they're really interested about the growth of the city, not the share of people living in the urban areas. No, it's how fast is my city growing? Because the faster it grows, the more infrastructure and social services I need to provide. So we want to look more at urban growth, take a city perspective, and we want to look at all the migrants, rural and urban migrants. That's what we do in this study. Now, finally, there has been a bit of work on employment in cities, but that has really so-called youth employment especially. These programs haven't been very successful, but they were sort of more focused on the labor market per se. So labor market policies, a bit of training of people, as well as a bit of maybe training plus some capital. That helped a little bit better, but generally not so much. So this is sort of the backdrop. Now, what did we find? First thing, in terms of the urban population and the role of migrants within the urban population. So actually, and I think it's an important and interesting statistic, about 1/3 of the urban labor force are migrants. Now, we take a particular definition of migrants. When we say migrants, everybody who moved over the past 10 years in the city is considered a migrant within our study. There are many different ways you can define migrants. That's the definition we have opted to choose. So 1/3 of the urban labor force, at least 1/3 in the 7-8 countries which we looked at, are migrants. Of these migrants, about half moved in recently over the past 3 years. The other half have been there longer than 3 years. So that's a second statistic to keep in mind. And then thirdly, and that's why it is important to not only look at rural urban migrants, but also at urban migrants, 1/3 to 1/2 of the urban migrants, the people coming into the city, are actually urban migrants. They come from other cities. So there's quite a bit of movement between. So important to keep that in mind. Second key feature, migrants tend to be younger, they tend to have less dependents, and they tend to be more educated than the people, the natives of the places where they move to. And these differences, these gaps, if you want, are larger in the secondary cities, and they decline as you go to cities, and they're also larger for urban migrants than for rural migrants. So these are sort of some key features of the migrant population in the cities. The second key point, and that was the origin and the key question of interest, how are the migrants integrating into these cities? And that goes back to different views. You have the popular view of migrants being a burden, if you want, or are they a boon? Are they good for urban development? What we find is that the migrants, by and large, integrate well in the urban labor markets. So we don't find this notion that they're joining the ranks of the unemployed. No, they tend to be employed, more employed than the locals. They tend to work more. Wages can be a little bit different, but in general, their incomes and consumption levels are on par, if not better, than the locals. That's the second key finding. It's, of course, a bit of a static view. The third finding, and that's sort of the dynamic view, because even if you integrate well, that doesn't mean that you can install a dynamic which is sort of deteriorating or a virtuous dynamic. And that's more difficult to establish. We looked a little bit into that, and basically, again, for one of the case countries, we managed to look more rigorously into it and generally find that there's a positive contribution to urban development, but we can go further into that. Finally, as key findings in terms of policies, this notion of only looking at labor market policies is not good enough. It's about urban development, creating demand in the cities for jobs. So it's about a broader approach that's needed. It doesn't require migrant-specific policies necessarily, only when there is a very divisive issue at hand, maybe certain ethnic groups. And even then, there is the need to get with policies where anybody can benefit, but maybe it's more spatially focused within the cities if there are certain ethnic groups or so that settle there. So that could be a reason for migrant-specific policy. But in general, it's about generating more jobs, more vibrant cities, which benefit all. Let me stop there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Luc. We'll have the opportunity to go back to some of these issues in more detail. I turn to you, Nancy. You're joining us remotely. The volume analyzes specifically 4 cities in 3 countries. Could you give us a brief overview of those 4 cities in terms of their demographics and some of the perhaps socioeconomic challenges that they face?
Of course. First of all, thank you so much for having us here. It's really a pleasure. And just good morning, good afternoon, everybody. So to your question, Etienne, yes, we actually, in our work, we look at 4 cities. in 3 different countries. We have Jijiga in Ethiopia, we have Jinja in Uganda, and then we have Jendouba and Kairouan in Tunisia. So let me give you a little bit of a background on each one of these cities. First, Jijiga in Ethiopia. Jijiga is a regional capital of the Somali region in Ethiopia, and it's actually located in a trade corridor between Ethiopia, Somalia, and Djibouti, and because it's in a trade corridor, then the economic activity that dominates this area is actually trade and commerce. It's the 10th largest city in Ethiopia, and it has a population that was estimated in 2020 to be well over 200,000 individuals. And migrants are coming into the city from Ethiopia, like in many other, like in the other cities that we studied in this report. In Jinja, in Uganda, is a little bit smaller, 83,000 individuals. And it's a city that is actually only 80 kilometers away from the capital city, from Kampala. This is also a city, just like Jijiga, that is considered to be high economic potential. It has a history of hosting manufacturing activities, and we see that many people actually commute from neighboring villages and towns to work into the city. Some have estimated that actually the city hosts about 5 times more people during the day than at night. And then we have the cities in Tunisia, Jendouba and Kairouan, that are also intermediate cities, but they're different in that they are in 2 of the poorest or the most lagging regions, internal regions in Tunisia. So because they are in lagging regions, they're challenged with low economic growth, they have high unemployment levels, and something that is different also in the dynamics of migration of these 2 cities is that if you think about Tunisia, already 2/3 of the population live in urban areas. And what we see in cities in Tunisia is that, yes, you see large inflows of migrants, but also large outflows. So these intermediate cities sometimes play the role of stepping stones in the move towards cities in the coast that are more economically dynamic. So one thing that is interesting is, despite having these broad economic characteristics, social characteristics, we find actually common challenges and some of our findings are actually common across all these cities. For example, in all these cities, we find that the outcomes of migrants in the labor market in these cities is actually not consistently worse than the outcomes of non-migrants. Just to mention one of the examples, we find through our regression or analysis that in Jijiga, urban migrants in urban areas are about 20 percentage points more likely to be employed than non-migrants. This is something that Luke was also mentioning already, and rural migrants are actually 30 percentage points more likely to be employed than non-migrants. These are patterns that we also see in Jijiga and in our cities in Tunisia as well. There is a second common point that we find, despite, as I was saying, despite the different characteristics, which is that rural migrants actually complement urban labor markets. And we find that in all of our 4 cities. We find that rural migrants fill an important labor supply gap in both dynamic economies of Jijiga and Jinja, but also in the more in the more lagging areas, anchored in the cities of Tunisia, in which the cities of Tunisia are anchored. And a third trait that I would like to highlight, because it's also common to the four cities, is that it speaks to the challenges of migrants that are not necessarily linked to the labor market challenges, but to the integration into the cities and accessing services, or sometimes also facing some discrimination in labor markets. For example, our qualitative surveys in Tunisia actually elicit some responses of migrants, received some responses of migrants where they pointed at the challenges that they were facing in finding housing with good access to basic services, or discrimination. We also see that, for example, in Jijiga, many migrants are left without access to urban services because they require a residence permit. So another reason, but similar outcome. And in Jinja, we found that many rural to urban migrants end up settling in the center of the city, where wages and working hours and earnings are actually higher, but they have to cope with higher rents of the city center. So they end up moving into informal settlements. So we see that cities are very different in terms of size, of their location, of their economic structure, but they have these three commonalities in the way that migrants integrate into labor market, in the challenges they face in integrating into the city fabric, into the services, into the city life.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Luke, I want to go back to one of the points that we were discussing in earlier today. So migration from rural areas to urban center is traditionally perceived, as you said, as the main contributor to Africa's growth. However, the study provides a much more complete and complex typology of migratory flows, and it pays special attention to migrants that relocate from one urban center to another. I want to spend some time on that category of migrants. In what ways are these urban migrants different from rural urban migrants, particularly in the context of those secondary cities that we've been talking about?
Thanks a lot. Yeah, this was an important part of the study, and also revealed some new insights also for us. So, as I said, on general, urban migrants, that's people moving to an urban area, tend to be younger than the locals meaning where they move to. They tend to have fewer dependents, less children or less elderly people, mostly less children, and they tend to be better educated. That's on average across rural and urban migrants alike. Now, if you split that up, then you see that these traits are even more pronounced for urban migrants. So urban migrants tend to even be younger still, they tend to have less dependents still, and they tend to be more educated still. So that's one, and that's important because that basically gives them the opportunities to integrate into that urban labor market. And then if you now look at what that means and see how the urban migrants integrate into the labor market compared to the rural urban labor markets, and how that differs by secondary cities or cities, we get the following results basically. And these results are based on national cross-country analysis and are sort of replicated in the case cities, that Nancy just described, they're all secondary cities. So what do we see? That urban migrants coming from other urban areas moving to towns or secondary cities, they tend to be more likely to be employed. They're more likely to be employed than the natives, than the other people living in these towns. They tend to work longer, more hours. They tend to have higher wages, And as a result, unsurprisingly, they have higher incomes and higher consumption welfare levels than the locals. So they're the top, they're doing the best. Now, some of these are public employees, but not all of them. But in a way, it's like people, they sort themselves in the urban space and they try to find where they thrive best, right? So these are urban migrants who move to another urban place, in this case, a town, a secondary city, and they do well there, they do better. They're like becoming the one-eyed, if you want, is king in the land of the blind. But that's not necessarily, it's all bad, but they do well. The second category, rural town migrants, rural migrants moving to towns, they also tend to do at least as well as the locals. They're more likely to be employed, they work more hours, sometimes at a wage penalty, at a lower wage, but together that they're more likely to be employed, more likely and more work more hours, they get at least as high incomes as the locals and at least as high consumption levels as the locals. The third category is urban migrants moving to cities, urban city migrants. And there we find they do similar as the other people in the cities. Now, mind you, if you go to a city, the levels are higher, right? The income levels are higher, the consumption levels are higher, the education levels are higher, etc. So they tend to be more likely to be employed. This is urban people from other urban areas, from the secondary town. So the stepping stone that Nancy was talking about, like Jendouba and Kairouan, moving to maybe Tunis from these cities. So they come from another urban area. They are more likely to be employed than the locals. They're more likely to be tend to work more hours, typically a slightly lower wage, but not a lot. And in general, their income and consumption levels are about the same. So this holds even when you control for the characteristics of the migrants vis-a-vis the locals. So you control this is abstracting from differences in education levels, abstracting from differences in ages, etc. But they tend to do equally well. Now, the fourth category is interesting and sort of it links back to this whole popular notion and the past, if you want insights from the past. This is rural migrants moving to cities. This is going from a rural area to Dar es Salaam, going from a rural area to Kampala, going from a rural area to Tunis right away. And what we find there is they tend to struggle a little bit more. They're more likely to be employed. Actually, they can't afford not to be employed. They're more likely to work more hours. There is a bigger wage penalty. And as a result, despite all of that, they sort of get similar levels almost. There's not really much difference, especially when you control for differences in age, education, etc. Now, that latter category is more resembling the popular view. So the rural cities joining the slums of the rural migrants joining the slums of the cities. But if you look at these four categories, this last category is not the majority. It's actually maybe 25% of all the migrants. So you really need to take a full picture. And from the mayor's perspective, all of them are migrants. And also one caveat, the findings for this rural city migration are really based on three countries. This is Tanzania, Uganda, and Ethiopia. Tanzania, Uganda, and Ethiopia. And this is East Africa. And in East Africa, urbanization levels are still lower, meaning that sort of also resembles maybe more the situation of the 80s and the 90s, etc. So in a way, things are coherent, but you need to take a full picture to get the full analysis and see that things have moved on.
Right. Well, the picture that your study gives is that of the positive impacts that migrants have on urban productivity and welfare. Can you give us some more details on this phenomenon, the integration of the migrants into African urban labor markets, specifically when they arrive in secondary cities? How can that affect urban expansion, urban density?
So what we just described in the previous question is in a way is a static view, right? So you see, you look at the migrants and you say, okay, they're doing about as well as the others. That's only one part of the story. That doesn't mean that migration is necessarily good or bad, because it may instigate a certain positive or negative dynamic. And what are the channels through which this dynamic may work? And this goes back to the theories which we laid out at the beginning. One is, with every migrant which comes to the city or a town, the city grows, if there's nobody leaving. So every net migrant, the city grows. With city growth, you get more density, meaning there are more people living on a smaller place. And that could then instigate these positive effects through people can learn better from each other. There may be better matches between a firm and the right skills, so the right person on the right place in the job, the right person on the right job. Or it also, some of the public goods erode. If there's 50 can serve 50 people or 100 people, as long as it's not fully congested, that's fine. So that's one channel. It's the density which has been found to lead to good effects. But you will all immediately say, that's all good and well, but actually, I only think about congestion. And that's also true. That's the flip side of that. There can be diseconomies of agglomeration. And these diseconomies of agglomeration are likely the larger if the speed at which the city grows is faster. If you double in 10 years, if the population of your area doubles in 10 years, that's a lot of work to do to keep up with the infrastructure, the roads, the social services, etc., even in a developed country, let alone in a country where the institutions aren't as good. So these are two forces which work in different ways, in opposite ways. Now, the larger the city and the faster it grows, that if you go from 5 to 10 million in 10, 15 years, that's even a much bigger challenge. So the absolute numbers start to play. So for smaller towns and cities, it may be easier to manage some of this potential if you get the right capacity. So empirically, to study the effect of these sort of counterbalancing forces, that's what we did in the Uganda case, where we really managed to get the evolution of towns and cities and Kampala over time and see whether the influx of migrants versus the natural growth of the city, because cities don't only grow, and that's a very important point, and also coming out of this study, and has been studied elsewhere, but it's resonating in this study as well. Cities growth also because people living in the cities get babies. So basically, they grow naturally, and migrants add to that, right? So, but actually in Africa today, most of the growth, of the urban growth, comes from natural population growth. So that's the fertility of the population itself, as opposed to migrants coming in. And because of that, you could argue that basically the migrants may play less of a role. But empirically and sort of in a more rigorous way, in Uganda, we were able to look at that and see whether if adding one migrant to the density, or if density increases, then it becomes because a migrant increases the density, or because people born in the city increase the density. We do find that a migrant increasing the density has a positive effect on all the labor market outcomes, the share of people employed, the share of the time they work, the wages, the income, the welfare, so the whole range of labor market indicators. While if it's a person born in the city and adding, that doesn't has an effect. So in this way, it's sort of adding to the density has a positive effect. We don't find a negative effect in the Uganda case by adding to growth.
Thank you, Luc. And I turn to you again, Nancy, and I want to zoom in to get to the level of municipalities. What kind of policies do you feel are needed to facilitate the integration of migrants in the socioeconomic fabric of secondary cities, and really to leverage urban migration in ways that can benefit migrants and non-migrants alike?
Well, again, I think a key message, a very important message that this report brings actually for majors, for municipal governments, is that migrants are really a force that can be leveraged for the growth of the city. So rather than putting constraints or stopping or fearing inflows of migrants, really policymakers can take proactive measures that actually can facilitate their integration into the city, and through that improve the labor market, but also improve the overall quality of both migrants and non-migrants alike. I think so. What this report says is really that to support that integration, it is very important to look beyond labor market policies and actually thinking about or focusing on how cities are planned and are managed more broadly, but bringing migrants into the core of those city planning, urban planning, and management policies. Why? Well, because as Luke was already saying, what we find is that labor market outcomes for migrants in secondary cities do not seem to be worse off than those of non-migrants. So that tells us that it's important to support the integration of migrants into the socioeconomic fiber of the city, and that will require actions that go beyond labor market and more into the functioning or the provision of services, but very importantly also into the functioning of land and housing markets, so that migrants can find affordable housing with access to basic services to live, for example. We stress three main areas of action to support the integration of migrants, and these three areas of action actually speak to the title of the report. So what we say, it's important to support the well-functioning markets in the city, markets for firms to thrive, for, as I was already saying, land and housing markets for people to have good quality and affordable housing. Build capacity of majors, so ensure markets function well, focus on building capacities of majors to provide services to their citizens, and target migrants when needed in those cases where they face specific disadvantages. So first, support markets. What do we mean by that? Support markets with more information for better urban planning, with less red tape for businesses, so that firms can come into the city and also have access to well-functioning land markets to put shop, but also with forward planning to provide better urban infrastructure for all citizens. Lifting constraints and red tape, as I was just saying, can help the business environment of the city, and that can help create employment opportunities for everyone. Especially, for example, if we think about cities like Jendouba and Kairouan, where I was saying at the beginning, the economic activity has been lagging and labor demand is weak. So creating the enabling environment for businesses to thrive, it's going to be very important to activate local labor markets. I was talking about housing and land. So addressing housing and land affordability is gonna facilitate the integration of migrants into the city fabric, facilitate access to jobs for both migrants and non-migrants alike. The second key pillar, let's say, of policy action that I was mentioning is build the capacity, the ability of majors to respond to the needs of all urban dwellers through, for example, stronger finances in the city that allow investments in better public services, a stronger capacity to provide these services, but also stronger capacity to better engage with citizens, to bring citizens into the planning of city. Having the stronger physical and technical capacity in cities can actually help them to create, can help majors create or build the necessary environment to so that the business environment that I was mentioning before thrives, or to create more cohesive communities, or as I was saying, with stronger physical and planning tools, then majors can also provide better services to their citizens. And then the third pillar that I was mentioning is targeting migrants. When there are divisions that are strong, divisions that can happen where migrants live or where they work. In those cases, it's going to be important to have targeted policies that help blur those divisions between migrants and non-migrants. A focus on these targeted policies can, for example, help improve the conditions of migrants if they're facing discrimination at their place of work, or if they have access only, or they're living in informal settlements, then it can help improve quality of life in those areas. Targeted action to expand access to services when needed, if services have been lagging, for example. So just to summarize, if you have to put in one sentence, let's say, what are the policies, what to do, it's really that message that I was mentioning at the very beginning. Majors or local policymakers need to take a broader view of migrants and markets, and focus on how cities are planned and managed more broadly, and really bringing migrants or integrating migrants into all the urban management and investment decisions, and recognizing that their contribution, the contribution that they bring to the city, to the labor market in the city. Let me stop here.
Thank you so much, Nancy Lozano Gracia and Lou Christensen. Stay with us for the rest of the event. We, of course, wanted to include the perspective of someone with direct experience from these issues at municipal level. Mr. Safi Ahmed, the mayor of Jijiga in Ethiopia, one of the 4 cities studied in the report, is unfortunately not able to join us as was originally planned, but he was kind enough to send us a short video with his answer to a question that we asked him. I'll let you and everyone joining us today listen to this short video.
We are kindly requesting the international funders and the other stakeholders to help us the immigrant issues. We are the center of Berbera corridor. More immigrants are coming from Somalia, P2R. Others are coming from Somaliland. We are requesting 2 main things from the funders. The first is infrastructure problem. More immigrants are entering in our cities. They are searching school, health centers for health facility, access, and so on. So we need to get support from the side of the infrastructure. Again, we need to get from what is known as institutional development. To get a better service or to give a better service for this community, we need to develop our institutions. So we are requesting to help us the institutional framework, the institutional development at large. I would like to say for you, thank you.
We are now joined by Ellen Hamilton for response from an operational standpoint. Welcome, Ellen. Dr. Ellen Hamilton, you hold a PhD in geography from Columbia. You're lead urban specialist for the Urban Resilience and Land Global Practice, Europe and Central Asia region at the World Bank. Thank you so much for joining us, Ellen.
And thank you so much for having me. And also, it was so inspiring to hear the words from the mayor of Jijiga, because as usual, mayors are able to capture in a few sentences the real essence of what we're here to talk about, and actually what the ask is to us, the international community, in terms of how we can support mayors. And so we heard from the mayor about the importance of help with the service delivery agenda, but also with the institutions and the capacity in order to deliver those services. And these are absolutely key. So what I'd like to do is maybe just give a few reflections, but also from the perspective of some of the ways that we, as one of the members of the international community, can and have actually provided some support to these types of areas. And we heard some very important messages that were not necessarily accepted as fact. It's the conventional wisdom, the normal thinking is, oh, the migrants come, it's a problem, there's not enough jobs, they drive locals out of jobs, etc. And what we heard was actually something that the study shows is there's something quite different going on. And this is a really important message. But this study also points to the importance of the third M, the mayor, and the mayor's wedge, and the opportunity for mayors to help help create an attractive, enabling environment for business and for private sector, so that you get the job market is able to respond, et cetera. But also with how the real challenge that many of the migrants face is not so much on finding the job, but it's on the more basic things, like how to find basic services and how to gain access to housing and land. And here is where mayors are absolutely essential, because mayors at the end of the day are able to, yes, they have a role in terms of private sector development, but they have an even bigger role, I think, in terms of how cities are organized and managed, and most importantly, how they deliver services. So this report is a bit of a call for us to be responsive to the needs of mayors in terms of integrating these migrants, regardless of whether they're rural to urban or urban to urban, better into the city, and not assume it's just about targeted labor policies, but to recognize that actually a lot of what's really missing is this ability for mayors to keep up and to manage growth, to plan for and to help manage the growth. Of course, the growth, there's economic growth, there's population growth, comes from different sources, but clearly things like more information, reducing red tape for businesses, that kind of stuff, which is part of what the mayor can do, is very important. Is also opportunities for local economic development, especially in poorer places, in poorer cities and smaller cities where that may be the opportunity to actually get better and more development. But let me give you a few examples of how we, as the international community, could and have supported some of these both lagging regions, if you will, and these cities that are and towns that are growing so quickly. So one example is in the country of Egypt, where the World Bank has a $500 million project that actually supports 4 lagging governorates. They're called, these 4 governorates together are called Upper Egypt. And what's interesting about this project is 2 things. First, the way it's designed, so it pays for results. And secondly, that it supports both infrastructure and services and capacity, but it also supports the business enabling environment in different ways. And the way it does this, what the project brings is it brings a spatially coordinated approach to the development in this region. And so the different kinds of investments, whether soft investments or hard investments, are not made independently from one another, but are made as part of an overall program. And so because the investments and the activities are coordinated, they have been bringing strong results. So that's one example. A second example, I think we could find in Buenos Aires, where there's another, where we have another World Bank project that supports a particular neighborhood in Buenos Aires. And this is a neighborhood that has had a big population growth. It's a poor neighborhood. It's informal. It has a lot of residents, about 43,000 people, most of them pretty poor. And the question is what to do. And so here, the project supports an integrated approach that is both a combination of basic services, of bringing in sewerage, roads, electricity, these kinds of basic services, and making sure not just that they come into the neighborhood, but that they don't stop at the neighborhood. They actually reach the households in the neighborhood. But it also is supporting elements connected with housing and rental in different ways. So at the low income, both sort of upgrading, if you will, and also a program for rental housing support for poor people living in the neighborhood. And this is actually quite important to have this mix of housing in there. And then it has a series of activities connected with employment and improving sort of job access and job opportunities within this neighborhood. So you have the three elements working together. It sits, one of the major results or the major understandings from the project is the importance of property rights, of improving property rights, and of working to improve the way land markets and housing markets work. And this is something that we see across the globe. Third example, which I will just describe quite briefly, is in Venezuela. Is in Colombia, but it is aimed at one of the major target groups or beneficiary groups are migrants from Venezuela. Needless to say, these migrants from Venezuela have had there's a reason why they migrated, many of them. The situation in Venezuela has been very difficult. And here, this project provides different kinds of targeted support, different kinds of housing solutions to different kinds of people. And with the importance here of some rental support solutions exactly for the Venezuelan migrants, because often what happens is the programs are not really conducive to international migrants of different kinds. So most governments are reluctant to provide large capital investments or large, like build a house and give a house to a migrant that is not from their country, which is totally understandable. And yet at the same time, there's a need to integrate those migrants also into the community. So, and I think the last kind of division or the last kind of program that the authors discussed was the need where you have a particular group that was discriminated against or that has particularly difficult circumstances. I think the Venezuelans are one example of that. Another example would be in the case of Accra, where we're supporting urban upgrading activities in Nima, which is a large community that is minority Muslim migrants from the north, and they face a lot of different kinds of discrimination and challenges. And this project is actually a part of what this project is doing is helping to integrate them in, including improving the local environment. So I wanted to say thank you to the authors and thank you to AFD for this event. It's a very interesting piece of work. And certainly as someone who works with projects in different parts of the globe, it's one that for me has useful messages and understandings that will help develop better projects to help our counterparts and the cities themselves, as we heard from the mayor just before this, to overcome some of the challenges that he's facing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hamilton. It was a pleasure to have you, and thank you for providing examples from different parts of the world that enter in a dialogue with what we've been discussing in the context of Africa. We now have some time for some questions from the audience. I think some of our audience members, Luke and Nancy, were curious about how the four case studies were selected and chosen. They are in East Africa and in Tunisia. Why these countries? Is it? Can you explain how these cities were selected?
Yes, it's a very good question, and they were given to us. So we didn't select them. So basically, this study started with Cities Alliance approaching us. Right. They were looking into this topic, and so we worked with them. They provided most of the funds for this study, actually. And so they had 4 case cities selected. They are different. But yeah, it's not a representative sample or purposive selected sample. So these were the 4 cities. Now, having said that, the evidence is not just from these 4 case cities. So we also looked at sort of existing data. And I think there was a question on East Africa. So getting good data on migration is not easy. Let's just be clear on that, and then being able to overlay that with...
What are some of the challenges, of getting that data?
Just the information, what's a migrant? So you need to have, where do they come from, birthplace. So there are different types of data. You have censuses, then your census covers everybody, and they typically know whether you're born in this place or not. But you also then, that's good, that's very strong. The challenge with this data is they don't have good information on labor. At best, you know whether you're employed or not. But of course, how much you earn, what wage, how long you work, what's your income, none of that is in the census. So you won't have that information there. Good information on identifying a migrant, knowing where they come from, but nothing else. You have other types of surveys which are better at these labor market outcomes, but often they don't know where the people come from. So you need to find surveys which have a bit of both, and then you need to overlay that with the boundaries of the city, because the urban area can be defined in different ways, etc. So it's a bit of a puzzle. And that then also defined, in a way, partly data availability. Now, we looked at 7 or 8 countries, and then in the really deep dives, the econometric analysis, they were largely on the very deep dives with all the layers: employment, time spent, wages, income, consumption. That's only for 3 countries, and they happen to be East Africa. For 6 countries, we had more whether you're employed or not, so we could do so. So it's a bit of a mix, and we put it all together. But yes, West Africa, I think, could be better represented than it is, and it's the first cut at these things. But there isn't much available in this space.
So, and that's another question from the chat. Can the results from these 4 cities be extrapolated to the rest of the continent? To what degree can that be done?
We don't really extrapolate just the results from these 4 cities, because we have these other national representative surveys there. We also from these 7 or 8 countries. Interesting, as Nancy was highlighting, even among these 4 case cities, which are quite different, there are commonalities which resonated with what we found in the other in the national cities, which resonated with the earlier study from West Africa, even though it was the 80s and the 90s. So all of that is sort of pointing in the direction. And I think that's sort of where we are.
Absolutely. There's also an interesting question in the chat about temporary migration. Is it something that your study captures?
So we don't capture commuting. That's one thing. Apart from this case city, we try to look a bit further into that. But that's just Jinja, which was a reason was so fortunate in a way. We didn't analyze it in depth. Now, we have basically in the surveys, we know whether people are recently there or not. So if you're there, you're captured in the survey. Now, whether all of them are captured or not, I think that's a fair question. But you have recent versus longer migrants. And what we do see is that the longer you stay, the more you integrate, which doesn't mean that even more recent ones still have and depending across these four categories, urban town, rural town, urban city, rural city. So it's kind of, the longer you stay, the better off you are, but it's not like you're total desperate if you just arrive in the past 3 years. So there is, if it's regular in and out, that may not be captured. It's a snapshot, that's true. It's sort of cross-section. But whether you arrived recently is in there.
Thank you so much, Luc Christiansen, Nancy Lozana-Gracia online, and you, Ellen Hamilton, for a fantastic response. To give concluding remarks, I now invite Professor Stefan Straub, the Chief Economist for Infrastructure at the World Bank. Thank you very much for a very rich discussion. Special thanks to our colleagues from the French Development Agency for organizing this event, and the mayor of Jijiga, the engineer Shafi Ahmed, for joining us online. So let me try to give some takeaways from looking at the report and listening to the conversation today. I think there's a kind of starting point that we can all, in a sense, relate to our environment, even here as we speak, is that in general, in this world in which we live, rapidly urbanizing in developing countries, migration is generally perceived and pictured as a burden or something negative. So this report is interesting because it actually takes this question and starts looking at who are the migrants, where do they come from, what impact do they have on their destination, and try to move beyond this narrative that is, migrants are generally going to put pressure on already stretched labor markets, amenities, and generate more difficulties for local people. And I think this report is really interesting because it kind of changes this narrative in two ways. The first one is it's actually give us a positive message on the quality of migration, and I think that's a refreshing perspective because it's rooted in analysis, in real data, and not just on opinions. The second one, which might be more specific to the context of developing countries, is the focus on secondary cities, which I think was really missing from the migration analysis in general. So what we see, in fact, is migrants coming from to secondary cities, to urban settings, and making a positive contribution to labor market, to economic dynamism, to the actual fabric of the city, and being contributing to this thing that Luc mentioned, which are agglomeration economies, which we think is the main benefit of us human beings living in cities in the end. So now, where do we go from there? I think the challenge is to leverage this change of narrative and try to use it to think about how we can inform policies that kind of ride on this new information, this new awareness of the potential positive impact of migration, especially in this case in Africa, and inform policies. And I'll come back to that, but policies across the board, not only labor markets, because we're seeing here that there are many dimensions that are relevant. So let me try to summarize a few points, and I'll be repeating some of the things that have been said probably better than I could say myself. So first, cities are growing, there's rising urbanization, but most of it is actually coming from the cities themselves. It's just population growth within cities. It's not migration that is mostly driving the population growth in cities in Africa. And second, about 60% of the population is living in secondary cities. So this whole network of cities is having a even more important role as time goes by. Second, and I think that's a very important message, we may have this view that, it's all urban rural migration and the people who came are just leaving agricultural jobs and coming into the cities and might be less educated. And it's actually not the case. That most of this migration comes from urban
areas, from other urban areas. So it's urban to urban migration. And the people who come in, they're not performing worse than non-migrants. They actually facing challenges, but these are the same challenges that people face in the cities. So in fact, the problems, if there are any problems that policy need to address, the issues that policies need to address are not issues with the migrants, they are issues with the places, with the cities themselves. So from here, and I would maybe just mention a few ideas for further work. I mean, I see this as a beginning, and some of it actually came out in the question from the chat and in the discussion. First, there's a big analytical agenda just in terms of generating more data. Do this finding reflects what's actually happening across whole of sub-Saharan Africa, in other developing regions, across different city sizes? I think we cannot extrapolate from the findings to draw general lessons, but we can extrapolate the questions. And so that's the first thing we should be doing. So then the second thing is this idea of markets that Nancy was referring to, and how mayors can actually react to the information. So we're saying that migrants bring value, that they generate positive impacts on cities. So the question is, how do we actually capture part of that value to invest in the thing that were stressed here: better amenities, more services, and ultimately in the second step, more private activities, more jobs. And that's where policies need to be designed. Policies can have to do with density, zoning restrictions, but also, and we heard that capacity building is very important, because it's one lesson that people who work in development probably know very well, is that each place may share issues and things that can be learned from other places, but they also have their own specificities, their own characteristics, and then you need to tailor the local policies to that context. And in the urban context, it's particularly difficult because you need water, you need urban transportation, you need a lot of public services, and all this is a complex bundle of policies that has to be adapted to the local context. Each city has different geography, different planning history, etc. And finally, there might be some lessons on some further work that can be done on the migrant side, to mention the third M in the study. And we may want to anticipate, what's going to happen. We know climate change is going to have a big impact on migration. How will climate change impact the type of findings that we have here? So at the same time where we try to get information on a broader set of context cities and regions, then we might also try to get a better handle on okay, how is this going to change in this changing world, facing the big challenge of climate change that we're facing. And finally, maybe one question that comes to my mind is, we're sitting here talking about the potential benefits from migration, the positive impacts, and how to leverage them. And one big question is, why is it such a disconnect? I'm going back to my initial point. Migration is usually perceived as a burden, and here we are saying, you could have all these positive benefits. So if that's true, how do we actually carry that message to the opinion in general? How do we inform better on the potential benefits of migration? Because perceptions are also very, very important. And let me stop here and thank everybody again for a really stimulating conversation.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chief Economist. This concludes our virtual event. Thank you to all of you who joined remotely. I'll remind you that the report we discussed today is available in both French and English in open access on the website of both the World Bank and the French Development Agency. An abridged version in Swahili is also upcoming, as well as a podcast episode, that we recorded a few weeks ago with the authors of the report. It will also be available shortly. Please check out publications by the French Development Agency and the World Bank, and specifically the Africa Development Forum series, 30 titles since 2009. We're quite proud and happy to continue this great collaboration with the World Bank. Thank you, and thank you online, and to everyone who attended the event today. Goodbye.